morning. It is good to see you guys. My name is Kevin, one of the pastors around here. Answer me this question, fill in the blank. If I just had what, then all would be good in life. What's that question for you? How would you answer that question? If you just had what? Is it new countertops? Is it a car? Is it a spouse? What is that thing that would just make everything good in life? We always have this list of if-onlys. Right? We had them when we were kids. I remember being a kid and being like, if only I had that certain skateboard, then I'd be so much cooler. If only I had a Nintendo, or then you get older and you're like, if only I could get out of school for the summer, if only I could get a date. And then eventually you grow up and it's like, man, if I could only get the right kind of job, or get married, or get kids, or get that car. If onlys, we always have them. But what's crazy is in life, when we get the thing that we thought was this, if only I had it, it would fix everything, we find that it doesn't. That it can't deliver on what we unintentionally were looking for something to bring us contentment and fulfillment. It just can't. It's sad, isn't it? How easy discontentment comes to us. How contentment just seems so elusive. And that it's like this perpetually out of reach thing on the horizon. And we're wrapping up this series called Emoji, where we've been walking through this book in the Bible called Philippians, written by the Apostle Paul while he was in prison, to a group of Christians living in a city called Philippi, a church, a group of Christians that he had helped kind of plant and start. And he's writing back to them, speaking about how life is not about the pursuit of happiness, but about this pursuit of joy different than happiness. You know, happiness and joy, when you experience them, you want more of them, but the kind of joy that Paul speaks to is not a wishful thinking. It's not determined based on your circumstances. It's this internal thing that's just steady no matter what's happening in your life. And Paul points us towards this. And in chapter 4, where we're going to wrap up today, he turns the conversation towards contentment. And that real joy stems out of contentment in life, out of a certain skill that you and I have to learn to practice. In fact, in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 12, he says this very provocative, very powerful statement. Listen to what he says about contentment in his own life. Verse 12, he says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. What a powerful statement. Who doesn't want that to be true of their life? That in any situation, that you can be at peace. In any situation, you can have this sense of contentment. Paul's saying, man, I've learned that whether I have plenty or my life's full of pain, whether if I have all the if-onlys I could ever list or I have none of them, I have found the skill of being content. For Paul, contentment was not situational, but rather a spiritual reality, something true of what he believed and what was happening on the inside that had nothing to do with whatever was going on the outside of his life. In fact, what Paul is saying to you and I is that you and I can learn to be content even in the worst kind of situations. We could be content sitting in the hospital waiting room. We could be content going to work every day in a job that we hate or feel like is a dead end. We could be content in a mediocre marriage. We can be content sitting at the funeral of a close friend. That's what Paul is saying. The question is, do you believe that? Do you believe that's possible? Do you believe that could be true in your own life? Paul's saying that it is true, and you and I have to do the work it would take to learn that type of a skill. In fact, I don't know, how would you rate your contentment in life right now? Like, if there's a contentment scale of completely discontent and completely content, where are you? Or maybe think of your life in different categories, relationally or in your marriage or career or financially. Where are you in contentment with maybe your relationship with God? Where are you at in life right now? And where is some of the discontentment really stealing the joy out of your life? And the good news from what Paul says is that this isn't some gift that he received, but rather something he learned, which means you and I can learn how to do it too. What Paul is saying is that this is not going to just happen. We're not going to just happen upon contentment. You won't just wake up someday and find it. You and I will have to choose to be intentional about it. In fact, it reminds me of the story this Brad told us this week. Brad's one of our teaching pastors, if you don't know him. And he's out trick-or-treating with his kids this past Tuesday. And he said the 5-year-old neighbor boy comes over, knocks on the door, asking specifically for almond joys, which is kind of peculiar, right? And so Brad was like, oh, that's odd. But then as Brad's walking around with his kids, they kept crossing paths with this 5-year-old little boy, and he kept hearing him ask for almond joys everywhere he was going in the neighborhood. And he found out the backstory was that this boy's uncle was over and told him, I'll give you $5 for every almond joy you get tonight. And this uncle, thought he was like $10, $15, and Brad's like, I'm pretty sure he's out at least $100. And the moral of the story for that little boy, but even for you and I, is that it literally pays to be intentional in looking for joy. You're not gonna just find it. We're gonna have to pursue it. We're gonna have to work at it. We're gonna have to take next steps at this if you and I are gonna learn to live what Paul is calling us towards here in Philippians chapter 4. Now, Paul's gonna teach us some secrets to it, but before he gets to that, he mentions a couple things that I just wanna point out are like promises from God to you and I. If you and I learn how to cultivate contentment in our life, God makes some promises to us. And one of them that he says in Philippians 4 is that God promises peace. That you and I can have a sense of peace in our life as we learn to focus on this contentment topic. In verse 7 of Philippians 4, Paul said it this way: the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want a sense of peace that can surpass all understanding, all situations and circumstances of our life, any storm that comes against us? The kind of peace that God can give to you and I as we cultivate this contentment that will protect our hearts, guard our minds. That's a promise from God. But it's not just peace. God also promises us power. In verse 13, the Apostle Paul says it this way: I can do all things through him who gives me strength. This is one of the most popular, misquoted verses in all of the Bible. It's often referenced by a dude trying to max out his bench press, and that is not what Paul is talking about. Paul's not saying I can do anything. He's saying I can do all the things that God's called me to. What he's saying is that as I've learned to be like Jesus, to think like Jesus, to live my life like Jesus, to live in obedience to Jesus, God has given me the power that it takes to live that kind of a life, because it doesn't always come easy. So God promises you and I peace in this journey towards joy and contentment, and he promises us a power to live life the way he designed us to live it. But not just that. He makes this third promise in Philippians 4, then he promises provision. God promises, as we cultivate this habit of contentment in our life, to take care of us. Paul says it like this in verse 19: and my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. And God's gonna meet all of your needs, not some of your needs. And he's not gonna meet all of your wants. That's what we wish it said. But God will meet all of your needs. He will provide and take care of for you. In this part of Philippians 4, Paul's actually commending them for living generous lives. He's saying, thank you for how generous you've been towards others. I'm reminding you, as you live this type of life, God will be generous to you. As you bless others, God will bless you. And the question becomes for us, how do we get this? How do we cultivate contentment? How do you and I take some next steps this week to become more content people? And I'll point to it again, that in verse 12, what Paul references is that it wasn't a gift that he received, but a skill that he learned, this contentment stuff. And as he was intentional in finding it and growing in it, so you and I can be. And he said, I've learned the secret of being content. And it's not like a secret like only a couple people know it. It's just, what he means is that it just doesn't come natural. Contentment is not common knowledge. And it's so sad, especially for you and I as Westerners, as people who lived in a developed world, as Americans. We have so much wealth and so much comfort and so many conveniences, and yet we find contentment to be so elusive. It just doesn't make sense. And so Paul's gonna give you and I 4 secrets to cultivate contentment in our life. And the first one is an unlikely one. It's not one you're gonna expect. I'll give you the other 3 in a minute, but those ones will be kind of like, oh yeah, I'm in church, I expected you to say that. But this first one, Paul starts this contentment journey in a place that you might not expect. Because the first secret is that you manage your relationships biblically. Paul is gonna point out to you and I that one of the things that makes or breaks contentment in our life is our relational tension that we have with people. And when we don't treat other people the way God calls us to, it has this way of just fracturing our joy and our contentment and stealing the peace that God wants in our life. Here's what he says. He opens chapter 4 this way. We'll read just verse 2, but he says this: I plead with Euodiah and I plead with Syntyche to agree with each other in the Lord. And he goes on to ask a couple of the people in the church community, hey, help these ladies work out this issue because it's stealing their contentment and it's affecting the whole church. Paul's saying one of the temptations you and I will struggle with as we try to pursue joy and contentment, we might ignore this relational component to our life, and our quarreling has a real way of messing up our contentment. What's funny about these two ladies is we don't get to know a whole lot about them. In fact, and we don't know what they're fighting about. Euodia and Syntyche are arguing and in some kind of fight and spat big enough that everybody seems to know about it. And maybe they're fighting about who has like the most ridiculous name. And you always gotta love biblical names because they're just goofy. And anytime anybody's like, oh yeah, I named my kid a biblical name, it's like, yeah, you picked an easy one. Like Matthew, Mary, like that's, how about Syntyche? Euodia. Anyway, they're quarreling, and whatever that thing is not just affecting them, but it's affecting the whole church. And so Paul calls them out in front of everybody. Imagine if we did that at 242. Before we get going today, I'd like to just point out that Billy and Bobby are fighting, and we would like you to knock it off. But that's basically what he's doing. He wrote this letter. He knew they would read it in front of everybody because he's saying, hey, we've got to get past this. Now, we know from what Paul says about these two ladies that they were instrumental in helping him mobilize the church when he came there to help plant. They were great leaders and servants and helped the Jesus mission happen. But now something's happened between the two of them, and it is robbing their contentment and that of the church. And Paul's saying, come on. And here's the inconvenient truth for you and I. If you're a follower of Christ. If you're not sure about all this Jesus Bible stuff yet, you can ignore me for a second. But if you are a follower of Christ, you believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus, you and I are not afforded the ability to ever say we hate somebody. We are never afforded the ability to treat other people as disposable. We can't write people off. We can't be better than anybody, marginalize or oppress other people. You and I can't even say we don't forgive people. Because see, Jesus calls you and I to be people like him, and what he promises you and I that we'll never, ever be asked to forgive another person for more than we have been forgiven. Now that doesn't mean that it's easy, and it doesn't mean that you're in the place to forgive yet, but Jesus just says it's not an option. It's not on the table. We can't hate another person. As a follower of Christ, we believe we were made in the image of God, and so is every other human. Now, Jesus would take this conversation really, really far in the cultures. He spoke to a first century Jewish people under the oppression of the Roman Empire, and he said, hey, your enemies, love them. Do you know who their enemy was? Rome. Do you know what Rome had done to them? Taken their land, killed some of their family, raped, oppressed. And Jesus says, oh yeah, your enemy, love those people. Why? Because they need a savior like you do. They need grace like you do. And as you understand who you are and all that you've been forgiven of, Jesus turns you and I into agents of reconciliation the same way he has reconciled our relationship with God. So we become like that, which means we can never write people off. It means we can never hate people. It means we have to work at always reconciling in relationships. It's a lot harder. In fact, even more than that. That part of the way we worship God is the way we treat other people. See, God doesn't leave this just between you and him and your relationship. It's also how you deal with all the people that he put you on this planet with. In fact, you know the Apostle Paul says when Christians, when we get together and we take communion, we should do two things. Whenever we take communion, before we take it, we should, before we remember the death and resurrection of Jesus, we should, one, look inside ourselves at our own sin, our own issues, and ask for forgiveness. But two, we should go deal with whatever relational strife there is and offer forgiveness and reconcile relationships before we take communion. God is saying, hey, I can wait because people are important and they're valuable and they're made in my image and I died for them too, just like you. And so, hey, I can wait. Go deal with that. Go heal that relationship. And I know there are some of you here today, and the thing that is stealing the joy out of your life and the contentment is the relational stresses, the turmoil and the quarreling. And this is a reminder from the Apostle Paul to deal with that thing. In fact, the Apostle Paul said it a little differently when he wrote to the church in Rome. He said it like this in Romans chapter 12, verse 18. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with other people. This is one of those Bible verses, like, I hate this Bible verse. A fly literally just landed on my face. This is one of those Bible verses that I don't like, because think about this. No matter what the strife is in your life, is it possible? Absolutely. And so then what he says, he puts it on me. As far as it depends on me, live at peace with other people. Man, that means every time I'm in a fight with my wife, have I done everything as far as it depends on me to be at peace and to reconcile that relationship? Anytime there's tension in any relationship in my life, as far as it depends on me, am I choosing to live at peace with other people? And do you know what the answer to that is every time? Nope. I haven't done as much as I can. I haven't gone as far as I can in offering forgiveness, in being a person of peace. I just haven't. So I don't know what this looks like for you today, but God is calling you on this journey towards joy, towards contentment, and you've got to deal with whatever those relationships are in your life that are not being dealt with biblically. Jesus teaches us in Matthew 18 like a roadmap for relational problems, and it starts with whenever someone hurts your feelings or sins against you is the way he says it, that you privately go to that person, confront them, and the goal is to regain that friendship. It is to reconcile. It's not to be right. It's not to be angry. It's not even to be heard. And it's private. It's not gossip about it first and post about it on Facebook and then go to the person. It's go to them and honor them and heal that relationship and move on, because part of how you love God is how you love people. Part of how we worship God is how we treat people. And so I don't know what that looks like for you today. Maybe your next step is you need to go to some counseling, because your life is just full of a pattern of broken relationships, and you treat people like they're disposable. If they hurt you, make you mad, you're done with them. Or there's some issue or hurt in your life that just keeps tripping you up, and you feel like you cannot forgive them, and you've got to learn how to get to that place. Or maybe your next step, maybe it's in your marriage, and you need to start dating each other more often. Maybe you need to read some books. Maybe today's the day you need to skip communion and go offer grace and the forgiveness that God has offered to you to those people in your life. That's the first secret. Manage your relationships biblically. Here's the second secret Paul begins to talk about, which is pray consistently. Like I said, the rest of these would be like what you expect me to say in church. But man, Paul, when it comes to prayer, and especially in this book of Philippians, he just comes back to this topic again and again and again because of how important it is that you and I would be in constant conversation with our Creator. That there's just something that happens to us when we are talking to God often. Here's how he says it in verse 6 and 7. He said, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Don't be anxious about anything. In fact, you might not know this in the Greek, when Paul says that phrase, do not be anxious, the actual phrase is akuna matata. Did you know that? It means no worries. That's not true, but it is funny. I said it at 4 o'clock last night, and they just looked at me like either don't get it, Lion King, like they're too young for it. I don't know what the problem was. Or like they thought it was actually Greek. I don't know. But anyway, that's not true. But Paul's saying, don't be anxious about anything, but rather in everything bring it to God. In every request, every worry, every concern about tomorrow and the uncertainty of the world, and all of your worries and concerns, just bring them to God. Just pray consistently. If you want contentment, be in constant conversation with God about the very things that will steal your joy and your peace and your contentment. And offer them back to Him. And trust Him. Paul comes back to this so often because he believed so deeply in the power of prayer. For you and I, he had experienced it. He knew the power of prayer in his own life, but he just keeps coming back to it to remind you and I to be like him, to be people of prayer. To know that there's just something about coming to God that has the ability to unravel so much of the anxiety that we deal with in life. And man, in just our culture, anxiety is such a huge deal. Stress and worries and fears and medications and just like the stats are crazy about how affected our lives are by the magnitude of the worries that we carry around with us in life. And Paul is saying, don't worry, be prayerful. Pray more. Be in conversation with God. Press into the one who says, I'm the author of life and I've got everything in control. When you are worried about what you cannot control, come to the one who is. I don't know what that looks like for you. But if you want to find this joy that Paul's talking about, if you want to cultivate this contentment, it's not just deal with your relationship problems, it's also pray more consistently. Maybe for you, a next step to take this week is just to begin to be more honest about the anxiety that you carry, the worries and the fears you have about today and tomorrow in this world or your life. Ask someone to hold you accountable, that when you get anxious, you'll be more prayerful, not just anxious. That when you have your worries and your concerns, that you would bring them to God first. Maybe for you, you just need to be more disciplined about prayer, that it would become more of a habit in your life. Maybe you need to set an alarm that goes off a couple times throughout the day. And every time it does, it's just a reminder to pause where you are, invite God into that moment, offer up to him your worries and your concerns, which, as Paul says, just leads to these moments of thanksgiving. God, thank you for who you are. Paul's saying this stuff is so simple, and yet we just don't do it. And then we wonder why we can't ever achieve real contentment. We just got to pray more consistently. That leads to the third secret that Paul points towards. To cultivate contentment, you and I must learn to think correctly. See, following Jesus invites you and I to believe some things that are definitively true, some absolutes, and to begin to allow those things to, not only that we begin to think like them, but then we live like them. To think as Jesus did and live as he did, to think correctly. Here's the way Paul says it, verse 8 and 9 of Philippians 4. It says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. There is power in what we choose to think about and focus on and talk about and meditate on and dwell on. There's a power in that. And one of the very things that robs us of joy and peace and contentment is we choose to think about a bunch of stuff that's not good. We choose to focus on stuff that we can't control or is wrong with the world instead of focusing on the one who's in control and has placed us in this world. What Paul is saying is that as a follower of Christ, you and I do not have to fall victim to every thought that we think or every emotion that we feel, but we can bring every thought and every feeling into subjection to God's truth in our life, which means if we feel like a loser, like we're worth nothing, we can come to God and have him and hear him say, no, you're not, you are mine. If we think the world is falling apart and there's no hope for tomorrow, we can come to God's truth where he reminds us, no, I'm in control. I have this. You can trust me. That we take every thought and every emotion captive, that we learn to train our mind towards what Paul says is positive, is noble, is true, is lovely, is admirable, is praiseworthy, not thinking about what's evil or dark or horrible or pessimistic or awful or negative. In fact, Paul talked about this in other places. In his second letter to the church in Corinth, he talked about this from a different angle about who our enemy is. In 2 Corinthians 10, he said it like this: for though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. God has given you and I the ability, the power to take our thoughts captives. That any thought we have that doesn't line up with God's truth, we can get rid of it and disarm it. That any feeling or emotion or lie that we unintentionally believe in, we can bring it into subjection and obedience to Christ and what he says is true about you and your worth and your future. You are his, you are loved, you are forgiven, and he's got you. It doesn't matter how you feel about it, it's true. And he's inviting you to live as if it is true and not worried about what you cannot control. It's like what Paul is saying is, the saying, you are what you eat. He's saying, no, you are what you think. You are what you choose to think about. Your peace, your joy, your contentment in life has a lot more to do with what you choose to think about than maybe you realized. Ask yourself, how often do you think about what you think about? And that's what Paul's saying. Inventory what you choose to think about. And start thinking about the stuff that's actually worth thinking about. Focus your perspective in life on the stuff that God has promised you. Take inventory of it. Be more disciplined. Hey, if you're discontent in a relationship, Paul's saying, no, recognize they're not your enemy. Think about it correctly. If you're discontent in your job, Paul's saying, no. The Bible teaches us that we can go to work and view it as worship, that we can take our time and our talents and use anything that God's given us as an act of worship to him. And so even if you don't like your boss, you don't like your paycheck, the Bible says, no, just begin to think differently about what work actually is in a way that you're worshiping me through that process. When we think differently, it changes how we see this stuff that so often are the very things bringing the discontentment to us in life. If you're discontent financially, begin to get your mind towards gratitude, what Jesus calls us to live our lives oriented towards other people, serving other people, living generously. Sponsor a child in Haiti, do something. In fact, Tim, our worship pastor, just got back from a rain catcher's trip, and he went down to Haiti, and he posted these two pictures on Facebook that were probably as convicting to me as they will be to you. He posted this picture of a home where 8 people live, 2 adults, 6 kids. This is what the inside of the house looks like. And when he posted these pictures, people had like the normal responses, oh man, I needed that perspective. I need to be reminded of that because of just how out of tune we are with so many people on the planet. But Paul wants to push that a little farther today in Philippians chapter 4, because he's saying you could be content living in that. You might not want to. You might not believe that you can, but Paul's saying you can. He's saying you can learn to be content no matter what your situation in life is. And that actually leads us to the last secret that Paul points towards. To cultivate contentment comes with learning to just live generously. To not try to hold on to everything in this life, but rather to just give it away, to live generously with everything that God has given to you. You give as it is necessary. Here's what Paul said in Philippians 4. He said, for even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me aid more than once when I was in need. Not that I desire gifts. What I desire is more be credited to your account. I have received full payment and have more than enough. I'm amply supplied now that I have received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent. And so what he's saying for just a second is, when I was in prison, when I was planting churches, you guys have sent me gifts and money, and you've lived generously to help plant churches and help people take next steps. But he says, listen to what he says about that generosity, that they are a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice pleasing to God. And my God will meet all of your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. That promise is attached to us living generous lives. Paul's commending them for their generosity and compelling them to be more generous. He's reminding them of what they know to be true to keep living that way. You want to find joy and contentment? Live generous lives. It's far more simple than we make it. In fact, if you turn in the Bible from Philippians back to Acts chapter 20, Paul is teaching, and he quotes Jesus in Acts chapter 20, verse 35, and he says this, it is more blessed to give than receive. That Jesus said that, not your grandma, that's not some like nice thing. Jesus said it is more blessed to give than to ever receive. Jesus is telling you something that is completely contrary to how we think of the world. That the more you give, the better your life will get, not the other way around. I didn't say it, Jesus said it. He's inviting you to trust him, to test him even on it, and begin to live your life giving, not worried about whether or not you receive. This is such a tough topic for us as Americans. We make so much money, and yet our perspective is so skewed. We all think we don't have enough. I mean, there are studies done. Maybe you didn't know this statistically. If you're sitting in this room and you have a combined household income of $48,000 a year or more, you are in the top 1% of wage earners that live on this planet right now. 1%. But if you only make $37,000 a year, you're in the top 4% of wage earners on this planet. And there are studies done about our wealth and our richness and how there's just never enough. There was a study done by Gallup that asked people across the socioeconomic spectrum, what is rich? And what they found statistically is people who made 30 grand a year thought 60 grand a year was rich. People who made 50 grand a year thought $100,000 a year was rich. That rich is roughly twice as much as you make right now is what they found out. That it's a moving target, that it's not achievable, and it won't deliver on the contentment and the joy and the peace and the security that we all long for, because it's not where Jesus is pointing towards, it's to him. He's saying you can go chase those things, but you're just not going to find them. And so that's why Paul talks about this a ton. In his letter to the Corinthians, he talks about how God loves a cheerful giver. He calls them and compels them, keep living generous lives towards others and trust that God will be generous to you. That's why he's talking about it here in Philippians. See, discontent people have a really hard time being generous because their focus is on what they don't have, instead of realizing all that they do have. And that's why in week number 1, we use the analogy of Monopoly in this series. We talked, if you were here, Dave was here, and he talked about how like life from the Christian perspective is a lot like the game of Monopoly. For some of us, it goes really well. For some of us, it goes really terribly. But either way, at the end, we just put it all back in the box, and it's done. Doesn't matter how much property you own or how much time you spent in jail. Doesn't matter how much money you made or lost in the game of Monopoly. It all goes back in the box. And the Christian perspective is that this life, all of your money and all your possessions and all the things that you will accomplish and possess and have in this life, none of them will go with you into eternity. All just go back in a box. And so Jesus is inviting all of us to live free of those things, to enjoy them as the gifts that they are, but not view them as anything more. And that is exactly why we are doing this big give this weekend. It's an opportunity for us to practice living generously as a church. I mean, for us, this is an opportunity as a church to do what we call you to do, what the Bible calls you to do on an individual level, but for us to practice what we preach and to give away a whole offering. And we're not giving away a whole offering because we just have like piles of cash sitting around. We're like, let's give one away. That'd be fun. Because that's not it. In fact, since we ended our devoted building campaign back in the summer, our offerings have gone down. And as we continue to try to lead this church and steward it well, we as a leadership really feel like the call that God has placed on us is to continue to just be generous first and trust God with the rest. And that's what he's calling you to do with your life.